Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. We will continue reading from the book الأجوبة الجلية في الأحكام الحنبلية, or the clear answer in the Hanbali Rulings by Sheikh Musa bin Issa al-Qaddoomi rahimahullah. This is lesson number 22, where we'll be discussing the Arkan, or the pillars of the prayer. So let us begin. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Allahumma anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa 'allimna bima yanfa'una wa zidna 'ilman وعملا وإيمانا ويقينا يا رب العالمين. قال المؤلف رحمه الله نفع الله به وبعلومه وعلوم مشايخنا في الدارين آمين. As usual, we're reading from the translation of a Sheikh Khalid Shah. We are on page 67, section on the Arkan, in parentheses, fard acts of salah or prayer. So the word arkan means pillars, and this is obviously the plural form. The singular form is rukn, and as the author or the translator has mentioned, it does have the meaning of fard, but when we talk about the fiqh of the prayer, we usually use this terminology, the rukn or the arkan. And they're using this word arkan to emphasize the importance of these acts, just like the pillars of a house or a building. If they're not there, the building won't stand. So the arkan can be defined by, these are acts which cannot be excused if they're left out, either intentionally or out of forgetfulness or out of ignorance. So there's no excuse for leaving these pillars out, and any of the pillars that are left out will render the salah or the prayer invalid. The excuse or exception to that general rule might be in the case that someone is actually unable to perform one of these actions, and we will talk about that in more detail inshallah. So the author says, number 56, how many arkan of salat are there? What are they? And he replies, there are 14 arkan of salat, and the first one, A, qiyam, or standing upright for one who is able. So this obligation to stand is applying to the obligatory prayers, so the 5 obligatory prayers, not the nafil or supererogatory prayers, and as the author said, for the one who is able. So for the person who is not able to stand, they may sit even in the obligatory prayer. And just to quickly mention, it would be preferable for them to sit on the ground as opposed to on a chair if they're able to do so. And likewise, if they're able to stand for any part of the prayer, it is preferable that they stand for what they can stand, and then what they can't stand for, then they can sit. And the recommendation to sit, this should come from a reliable Muslim doctor, and this should be his own opinion, not an opinion that one has tried to kind of push him toward. The opinion of a reliable Kitabi doctor would also be appropriate. Kitabi meaning a Jewish or Christian doctor that is reliable. So this is the general condition for being able to use the chair or sitting in general, and Allah knows best. It's also okay if someone is maybe a little bit like slouched over, as long as what they're doing can be called as standing. However, the standing must be on two legs, assuming the person has two legs. So unless there's a reason why he can't stand on two legs, he should be on two legs. Otherwise, doing so without a valid excuse would render the prayer invalid. Okay, the author continues. B, the opening takbir, i.e. to say Allahu Akbar. So this takbirat al-ihram, the opening takbir, is what actually brings one into the state of the prayer, as is mentioned in the hadith, where Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, tahrimuha at-takbir. So its opening is the takbir, and as the author said, it is the saying of the word or words Allahu Akbar. And one must say this Allahu Akbar even assuming they're a new Muslim. They have to learn this. This statement can't be replaced with any other statement, and one should say this when he is standing, unless he is of the people who have the excuse not to stand. So in the word Allah, the lam or the L sound is elongated, and it is important to pronounce the Allahu Akbar correctly. So for example, in Dalil al-Talib, in its explanation, At-Taghlibi says, one cannot, for example, elongate the alif or the A sound in like Allah or Akbar. So one can't say Allahu Akbar. No, it has to be Allahu Akbar. And At-Taghlibi actually mentions 12 conditions for saying the Takbirat al-Ihram. I think we've mentioned most of them either directly or indirectly. Maybe just one thing to add from what he's mentioned is that for the one who's a follower, meaning not the Imam but praying behind the Imam, he shouldn't say his Takbirat al-Ihram until the Imam finishes saying his Allahu Akbar, and he specifies, when he pronounces the Ra or the R sound in Akbar. Another important thing that At-Taghlibi mentions in his Sharh is that whether one is an Imam or a follower or someone praying individually, and we can understand this is also applying to whether it is a prayer where one recites loudly or silently, but one needs to be reading the Allahu Akbar and everything else, including the other types of supplications in the movements or Surah al-Fatiha. One has to minimally recite it in a way that one can hear oneself, and this is obligatory. So when we say the silent prayer, like for example Dhuhr or Asr prayers, yes, silent refers to not reciting in such a way that other people hear you, but you should still hear yourself. And then the author goes on, C, reading Fatiha in the correct order with the 11 shaddas. Shadda is the emphasized sound. if even one shadda is omitted or a letter is left out and he does not go back to correct it, the salat will be invalid. If one does not know al-Fatiha and knows only one ayat or verse, he must repeat that for the duration of reciting Fatiha. So, the time that it would normally take someone to recite al-Fatiha, he should recite what he knows. So, like for example, if it's a new Muslim and he's only memorized Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, then he can just repeat that for the duration of the time that it would normally take to recite al-Fatiha. And I'd just like to emphasize on the issue of al-Fatiha. Many people assume they know how to read al-Fatiha correctly, and this includes even native speakers. But I've known many people who are unable to recite al-Fatiha correctly, and even myself, I would formally put myself in that category. So I strongly recommend that you find someone who really knows the rulings of tajweed. And I'm not talking about just someone who sits in the masjid a lot and you see him reading the Quran a lot, but someone who they've really studied tajweed. Minimally try to study Surat al-Fatiha with them, even if it's something you have to do maybe online, maybe you have to pay for this type of tutoring, but it's very unfortunate, but many people do not read al-Fatiha correctly, and it can have a huge impact on themselves and even on other people if they're leading them in the prayer, and Allah knows best. The author continues, D. Ruku' or bowing. So what we would define bowing as in its minimal sense would be that one has bowed, so like leaning forward, where at least his hands can reach his knees. So it's not necessary that he's in like a 90-degree angle, but this is what is minimal. However, the most correct would be sort of as I've put it, that one's back would be straight, meaning basically at like a kind of a 90-degree angle, and that he would also be keeping his head in that kind of a straight direction as well. So you would be bent over, holding your knees with your hands, and back and head would be level, kind of like looking, like a 90-degree angle. The author continues, E. Rising from ruku' with intent. So the fiqh books, including what At-Taghlibi has mentioned in his sharh, usually mention this kind of a scenario where someone would be rising due to being like frightened. So Taghlibi says if someone did rise from being frightened from something, it would not be sufficient, meaning his rising would not be sufficient to be counted as the rising that is a rukn or pillar. So he must go back to the ruku' and then rise again. And one will simply rise standing straight up as he was before the ruku'. The author continues, F. Al-i'tidal, or pausing while standing. So one just has a brief moment where they're not moving, and this will be sufficient as the pause. Then he goes on, G. Sujood or prostration. So the most correct or complete sujood or prostration will be where one is on the ground, he has his forehead on the ground, his nose, meaning kind of like the tip of the nose, the hands, the knees, and the tips of his toes also on the ground. So these are the 7 points that are touching the ground. And if we want to talk about from a minimal perspective what the prostration is, it would be that at least a part of those 7 limbs that we mentioned would be touching the ground. And as far as the feet, one would leave a small space between the feet, so they wouldn't be touching, nor would they be far apart. And some of these details we will be eventually getting to them when we discuss the sunnahs of the prayer. It is also important that the limbs, especially like the forehead, would be touching the ground in a stabilized manner, meaning the fiqh books usually give this example, including what Taghlibi has mentioned in his sharh. Like if someone was prostrating and there was like kind of like cotton on the ground, he can't just touch the cotton. He should really lean into it till his forehead is feeling like it is stable. There's no more need to push further. And they also give the example of if one were to be praying on snow or on grass, it's the same kind of principle. You would have to put your forehead down into such a way that you keep pushing until really you have no more resistance and the head would be stable. And if one were to fail to do this, his prayer would be invalid. At-Taghlibi, he also mentions that it would be permissible and valid if one were to prostrate on part of his clothing, such as a sleeve or part of his amama, the like head wrap or turban, or its veil, its tail, but he should have a reason to do so, otherwise it would be disliked. And some of the reasons would be, for example, heat or cold. It could also be something maybe on the ground that might hurt your head, but as long as there's a reason, there's no problem to do it, and the sujood would be valid. But as we said, it would be disliked to do so without a valid excuse. And then the author continues, H, raising from the sujood. So one, from the prostration would then sit up into some kind of sitting, and then that goes to our next one, I, sitting between the two sajdas or the two sittings. So anything that would be called sitting, and we're talking about sitting on the ground unless one has a valid excuse, so anything that would be considered sitting would be valid. However, it is sunnah to sit in a way that we call al-iftirash, where this is where, and I should mention, this is not the last sitting if it is more than a 2 rak'ah prayer, but in this case we would normally sit in the sunnah way, kind of like sitting on the left foot, so the toes would be pointed toward your right side, and you would be sitting on your foot, and your right foot would be kind of erected with your toes on the ground, pointing in the direction of the Qibla. Now, if this were the final sitting for a prayer that has more than 2 rak'ah, so we're not talking about the like Sunnah Ratiba prayers or Al-Fajr prayer, but for example Al-Dhuhr or Asr, Maghrib, Al-Isha, then that very final sitting would be slightly different. We would call it Tawarruk. So imagine the sitting that I've just described to you, but instead of sitting on the left foot, you would slide it out so that your left buttocks would like be on the ground, and that left foot would be kind of under the opening between your right knee and the right foot. If you search online, I think you can find a lot of diagrams, but it's this is called tawarruk. The other kind is al-iftirash. These are the sunnah sittings that we do in the prayer. And then the author continues, J, to conduct all the arkan or pillars, actions calmly. And this just means that for each of these actions you have a moment of like a pause. So if you're doing the sujood, you can't just go to the ground and as soon as all 7 limbs touch the ground, get up. No, there should be a pause. Likewise, when you sit between the 2 sujood or the 2 prostrations, you can't just get up and immediately go down. There should also be a short pause. The author continues, K, the last tashahhud, i.e. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, which will follow the first tashahhud, in parentheses, in a 3 or 4 rak'ah salah or prayer. So when you have the 2 tashahhud, when you read this Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, if there is a second one, the second one will be the rukn, and in the case that there's only one, that one is the rukn. So whatever is last is the rukn, even if there's only one. So there is a minimum way that one can read the tashahhud, which would be Tahiyyatu lillahi, Salamun alayka, ayyuhan nabiyyu, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, Salamun alayna wa ala ibadillahi salihin, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And the Taghlibi says Al-Kamil Mashhur, or the complete one is famous, and the author al-Qaddoomi will mention that wording in the next lesson. So likewise, if you have this book or another book, you can find the full supplication also in many of the books of supplication. You can find it there. And yes, there are some different wordings that have been narrated. So the one that we'll read in the next lesson will be what is the popular narration among the Hanabila. But like I said, there are other narrations, and they are all similar in meaning, if not wording. The author continues, L, sitting for tashahhud and sitting for the 2 salams. I think this is straightforward. Then he says M, 2 salams in the fard salat, which is to say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah As for nafil or supererogatory and janazah prayers, saying one salam is sufficient. And when one says this assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, you start on the right side, you turn to the right, and then you turn to the left and say it again. I think everyone is familiar with this, inshallah. Sometimes you hear people add wa barakatuh at the end, but according to our madhab, it is superior not to include the wa barakatuh. And for the non-obligatory prayers, saying it once is sufficient. So the author has mentioned nafil and janazah prayers. At-Taghlibi also mentions, for example, the tilawa or the prostration of recitation, and the shukr or the prostration of thankfulness. So in these prayers, a single taslim or saying assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah is sufficient. Regarding the prostration of recitation, I think you're familiar. There are 14 such verses in the Quran where one should prostrate if they're read, and they are denoted in the modern Qur'ans with a symbol. I think you're all familiar with this. If you're not, please just search it online. So there are 14 of these verses. If one is in the prayer, then one will just follow what the Imam does. So the Imam himself, he should say the Allahu Akbar when prostrating and rising, and also raise the hands in those movements. If it is out of the prayer, then this recommendation to do the prostration would only apply to someone who is kind of actively listening. So not just someone or anyone who overhears it, but someone who's actually listening to someone reading, whether it's themselves or another person, but they should be actively listening. The exception would be if the person who is reciting would not fit the criteria to be an imam. So for example, if you are listening to your wife recite, you're a man, the husband, the wife or woman in general can't be an imam for men. So in that case, one would not do the prostration even if he was actively listening. And in the case that one would be doing this prostration outside of the prayer, after doing the prostration, he would say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, but it would only be minimally required that he do it once, meaning on the turning to the right and saying it. And when he does that, he would not read the tashahhud, he would just say the assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah directly after the prostration. And the last rukn or pillar, the author says, and performing the arkan in order as mentioned above. So if one broke the order intentionally, then he would have invalidated his prayer. However, if it was done mistakenly, out of forgetfulness, then he would have to go back and perform it in the correct order. So At-Taghlibi, he gives the example in his sharh, like if someone were to make the prostration before the ruku'. So if he did that intentionally, the prayer would be invalidated. If he did it out of forgetfulness, then he would have to go back to the standing, then do the ruku', and then do the sujood. So this concludes the 14 rukn or pillars. And as we said, just to remind you, these are things that cannot be left out of the prayer. That includes left out intentionally, out of forgetfulness, or out of ignorance. The only times that they could be left out is when someone were to have a valid excuse. So for example, the new Muslim who cannot read Surah Al-Fatiha, he has other options of things that he can read until he learns to read Al-Fatiha. Or for example, the person who has some type of physical ailment, maybe they can't stand, so then they would be allowed to sit. But unless someone has a valid excuse, as we said, they have to be done. They can't be left out intentionally, out of forgetfulness, or out of ignorance. They have to be done. So we will conclude here. The next lesson, inshallah, we will talk about the wajibat, or the obligatory elements of the salah or prayer, and they will be 8. I think the next dars will be a little bit lighter than this one. As always, don't forget us in your dua. Don't forget our brothers and sisters who are in difficult situations. Don't forget our shuyukh who have left us this great inheritance. Don't forget those who are living and who have passed away. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.